I'm Ava Bennett, 31, and the last thing my mother said to me in a crowded room was that I was an embarrassment, the kind you keep off the holiday card. I kept my hands still and my voice steady, but my cheeks burned like a child sent to the hallway. My father watched me the way he watches a deal he's decided to pass, on expression flat, already moving on. My sister's nails clicked against her phone as if my presence were a notification she could swipe away. I stood there with the sinking feeling that someone had quietly erased my name from the family ledger. What I didn't know then was that one man had left me a line no one else could cross out. He had written it in ink, strong enough to outlast their performance. And the moment I heard his lawyer clear his throat, the room changed. Before I go any further, tell me where you're listening from in the comments and tap like and subscribe if you've ever had to keep your spine straight when someone tried to shrink you. I grew up in a house where the carpets were thick and the voices were careful, where handshakes mattered more than apologies, and the dinner table was a place to rehearse good news. My father, Thomas, built a real estate firm that moved quickly and spoke smoothly. My mother, Elaine, ran charity events with perfect centerpieces and practiced smiles. Brooke learned early how to shine under the lights, how to tilt her chin toward the camera and say the right thing at the right time. I was the quiet one who asked follow-up questions that made people pause, the child who didn't laugh just because others were laughing, the teenager who wanted to know what happened to families when the glossy brochures didn't match the fine print. Harold, my grandfather, didn't mind the questions. He called me his compass, said a person's direction was more important than their speed, and showed up with paper bags of peaches from the Saturday market like they were medals for telling the truth. When college ended, I didn't take the desk waiting for me at Bennett & Coman, even though the chair was soft and the paycheck generous. I took a case manager job at a women's shelter on the South Side that paid less than my classmates' rent and gave me a front row seat to the hard work of starting over. The difference between my days and my family's days fell into sharp relief at home. We counted square footage and memberships. At work, we counted safe nights and meals that didn't need to be hidden. On Friday evenings, I drove past restaurants where Brooke posed in new dresses and turned into a street where porch lights flickered and relief looked like a clean bed and a locked door. My parents said it was admirable for now and reminded me that adult decisions have adult costs. When I signed the lease on a narrow apartment above a hardware store and bought a second-hand couch, they asked if I was trying to prove a point. Little things turned into quiet distances that grew into rooms I wasn't invited to enter. Group texts shifted without my number. Christmas chairs filled without me. Explanations were delivered to other people about why I was so busy while my phone stayed blank. I learned the shape of an evening alone the way a rescue dog will lean its whole weight against your knee when thunder rolls the satisfaction of sanding a wobbly thrift store table until it stood steady. Harold still found his way to my door on Sunday's coat collar, turned up breath clouding in winter, saying nothing at first, and then everything in a few calm sentences. He sat through a shelter fundraiser, even though ties made him itchy, and afterward he said the room felt honest in a way he hadn't felt in years. I kept those small moments folded in a mental drawer like letters I wasn't willing to misplace. The first real crack came in the kind of silence you can't explain away. Harold died in late spring, and nobody told me. I learned about his funeral the way strangers do through a notice in the paper sent by a coworker who thought I already knew. While everyone else wore black and traded speeches beneath high ceilings, I set a candle on my windowsill and brewed tea the way he liked it. 2 spoons of sugar, watching the flame move when the air shifted. I told myself it was an oversight, that grief makes people clumsy. But the longer I sat there, the more it felt like a door softly closing. I didn't ask for an explanation. I didn't call to demand a place. I went to work the next morning and listened to a woman explain how a clean set of sheets made her feel like a person again, and I understood that dignity doesn't wait for an invitation. Days later, an email arrived from Martin Keene's office, simple and formal, with a date and a conference room number. It was the first direct line I'd seen in months, with my name spelled correctly and no apology attached. I read it twice then, a third time, half wondering if someone would retract it the way you pull a glass away from a table's edge. Even the subject line felt like a held breath. I thought about deleting it. I thought about forwarding it to my father and asking if I was meant to pretend I hadn't seen it. Instead, I drove past the shelter on my day off and circled the block where the law office sits in a renovated brick building with tall windows that throw rectangles of light across the floor. I parked at the far end of the street and sat with the engine clicking down, palms flat on my thighs, steadying my breath the way I do before difficult conversations. Inside those walls, there would be polished grief and careful sentences, and I would be required to stand without flinching. I wasn't going for money. I wasn't going for an apology that wouldn't come. I was going because the one person who had called me by who I was not what I could provide had left something for me to hear. I stepped onto the sidewalk and let the door close behind me, the sound bright and final, then walked the length of the corridor toward a plaque that read, "Conference Room C," the voices on the other side low and smooth, as if the ending had already been scripted without me. I reached for the handle and for a heartbeat held still. The door to Conference Room C felt heavier than it should have, the kind that wants to remind you it hasn't been opened for the likes of you in a while. The sound of voices spilled into the hallway before I even stepped inside, familiar tones wrapped in the kind of politeness that hides something sharper underneath. My father's voice was smooth and practiced speaking about legacy, the same way he talked about property lines. My mother's laugh followed high and brittle, while Brooke complained that the chairs looked uncomfortable for an event like this. I waited for the sound to fade before pushing the door open. Every head turned at once. It felt like walking into a theater mid-performance, except I wasn't part of the cast anymore. My mother's smile stiffened, her hand frozen midair like she'd been caught off script. "Ava," she said, the name clipped clean. "What are you doing here?" Brooke didn't even glance up from her phone before answering for her. She wasn't invited. "I received an email," I said, my voice steadier than I expected, "from Mr. Keen's office." I nodded toward the tall man at the end of the table, his gray suit pressed and his face unreadable. Daniel told me which room. The receptionist's name slipped out before I realized it, and for a second it sounded almost too normal, like I was back at work explaining paperwork to a client instead of defending my right to exist in my own family. My mother exhaled sharply. "I told them to take your name off the list." The words dropped like small stones into the silence. "You made your choice a long time ago, Ava." I looked at her, then at my father, who kept his eyes on the folder in front of him, as if this were a meeting he intended to get through without incident. "I didn't know grief came with guest lists," I said quietly. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then my father cleared his throat and said, "Let's not make this into something unpleasant. She's here now. Let's proceed." Mr. Keen adjusted his glasses and nodded, his tone measured. "The reading will begin shortly. But first, there's a statement your grandfather asked me to present." That silenced the room more effectively than any argument could have. My mother sat down slowly, folding her hands, her knuckles whitening. Brooke finally looked up, her brows pinched. Even my father straightened in his chair. As I took my seat at the far end of the table, I felt every gaze on me. The scent of polished wood and old paper filled the air. My mother's perfume floated just strong enough to remind me I didn't belong. Brooke crossed her legs, giving me a once-over that started at my thrift store shoes and ended with a smirk. I used to shrink from that look. Now I just sat back and met her eyes, until she blinked first. Mr. Keen placed a small recorder on the table. "For the record," he began, "we are here to read the last will and testament of Mr. Harold Bennett." His voice was calm, but his pause carried weight. Before he could continue, my mother interrupted. "Actually, before we waste any time," she said, her voice honeyed but sharp, "I think we should clarify something." Mr. Keen's jaw tightened slightly. "Mrs. Bennett, this proceeding, I know," she said, waving a manicured hand. "But I believe it's only fair to acknowledge the situation." She turned toward the relatives lining the side chairs. Uncles, cousins, people I hadn't seen since childhood. "Ava hasn't been part of this family for quite some time," she said sweetly. "She chose a different path. We wish her well, of course, but she's made it clear she wants no part in what we've built." A murmur passed through the room, the kind of uneasy sound people make when they'd rather be anywhere else. My throat tightened, but I kept my expression neutral. "I didn't choose distance," I said softly. "You chose silence." That made her blink. Then her smile vanished. "You're not part of this family anymore," she said, every syllable cold and deliberate. "And you won't get a cent." The words hit harder than I wanted to admit. For a moment it felt like being 16 again, standing in the driveway as they closed the door behind me after another argument about choices, values, and what counted as respectable. Only this time there were witnesses. Mr. Keene's voice broke the silence. "I believe your father-in-law would disagree, Mrs. Bennet." Her head snapped toward him. "Excuse me." He lifted a sealed envelope from his briefcase, the paper heavy and cream-colored, Harold's signature pressed into the wax seal. "Before we go further, I've been instructed to clarify one thing." His tone stayed even, but it carried through the room. "Ava Bennet is the sole beneficiary named in this document." The sound that followed wasn't quite silence. It was the sound of breath being taken and not released. My father's pen slipped from his hand and clattered onto the table. Brooke stopped tapping her nails. My mother stared, her eyes unblinking, as if she could will the words away. "That's impossible," she said finally, her voice shaking. "There must be a mistake. Harold would never— he adored his family. He would never leave everything to her." Mr. Keene opened the folder with slow precision. "There is no mistake. Mr. Bennet executed this will 6 weeks before his passing. It is legally binding and properly witnessed." My father leaned forward, his tone brittle. He was confused near the end. He mixed up dates. Mr. Keene stopped him with a single raised hand. Anticipating such concerns, Mr. Bennet scheduled a full cognitive evaluation on the same day he signed. The report from Dr. Olivia Hart of St. Matthew's Medical Center confirms he was of sound mind and full capacity. He placed a thin folder on the table and slid it toward my father. "Any challenge on grounds of competency will be dismissed." No one reached for the folder. Brooke swallowed hard. My mother's lips parted, but no sound came out. The air in the room grew heavier, thick with the kind of quiet that follows when a long performance has been exposed for what it is. Mr. Keene clasped his hands. "There are no further objections. I have one more item to present." He took out a small black USB drive and held it between his fingers. Mr. Bennet recorded a message to accompany his will. It was witnessed and notarized. The screen of a laptop glowed to life. My mother muttered something under her breath, but no one moved to stop him. The moment the video began, the chatter and whispers ceased. There he was, Harold Bennet in his worn plaid shirt and wire-framed glasses, sitting in the old armchair by his window. The sight of him pulled something deep inside me tight. His voice was calm, clear, and steady. "If you're watching this," he began, "then my time here is done." The room stayed perfectly still. "I won't pretend we were a perfect family," he said. "We weren't. I know this room is full of people who have worked very hard to look better than they feel. Appearances matter here more than truth ever did. But today, truth gets the floor." My mother's hands fidgeted in her lap. My father stared down at the table. Harold continued, his gaze level. "Thomas, you built your company on the backs of people who trusted you. You told them they were safe and you left them with nothing. I've seen the records. Elaine, you've spent years pruning this family tree until only what you wanted remained. And Brooke, every gala, every post, every luxury you show off, it wasn't yours to spend." Brooke gasped, eyes wide. He leaned closer to the camera, voice softening. "And then there's Ava, the only one who ever showed up without wanting something, the one who brought me tea and asked about my day." I could hear my mother's breath hitch. "I watched how they treated you," he said gently. "I watched you walk away with grace when they offered none. And for that, I leave everything I can to you, not because you asked, but because you never did." The screen flickered once and went black. For several seconds, no one moved. The air felt thick enough to press against my skin. Then my mother's voice sliced through it. "That recording, someone must have edited it. This is absurd." Mr. Keene didn't respond. He simply closed the laptop, his movements quiet but final. He opened the manila envelope once more, revealing Harold's official documents. "Per Mr. Bennet's instructions, he said I'll continue the reading in full detail next." I sat back, every muscle taut, the echo of my grandfather's voice still ringing in my ears. Across the table, my mother's polished composure began to crack. Brooke's phone screen dimmed in her hand, and my father's jaw clenched as he stared at the will like it might rewrite itself. In that stillness, I realized something had shifted, not just in the paper or the numbers, but in the air between us. The script my family had rehearsed for years no longer fit. The curtain had lifted, and none of them knew what to say. Mr. Keene gathered his papers, his tone as even as before. "We'll proceed with the full distribution. After a brief recess," he said. "I suggest we all take a moment." As everyone rose, I stayed seated, the hum of the air vent the only sound in the room. The next part was coming, the one where the details would land like stones in still water, and for the first time I wasn't the one who needed to brace. When Mr. Keene called everyone back into the room, the air was heavy and tense, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Chairs scraped against the polished floor, but no one spoke. My father's face had gone a shade paler, the practiced calm starting to crack around the edges. My mother kept her eyes on the table jaw tight, while Brooke sat stiffly, her hands folded in her lap like she was waiting for a cue that wouldn't come. The manila folder lay closed in front of Mr. Keene, the red wax seal broken, but intact enough to show the moment couldn't be undone. He cleared his throat. Per Mr. Bennett's instructions, he said, "I'll proceed with the distribution." His voice was steady, but the small pause between each line carried weight. "To my son, Thomas Bennett, I leave the framed newspaper clipping of the first house he ever sold, the only sale he made without deception." My father didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the folder, expression unreadable, but his hand twitched once before going still again. "To my daughter-in-law, Elaine Bennett," Mr. Keene continued, "I leave my late wife's etiquette book with the chapter on humility bookmarked." A soft cough came from the far end of the table, someone trying to hide a reaction. My mother's lips pressed together in a thin white line. She adjusted her pearl bracelet but said nothing. "To my granddaughter, Brooke Bennett," Mr. Keene read, "I leave the receipts for every charge made on my personal account." He paused, looking up just long enough to meet Brooke's eyes. "May it remind her that grace cannot be purchased." The silence that followed was sharp. Brooke's breath caught as her face flushed, then paled. She shifted in her seat, whispering something to herself that no one could hear. Mr. Keene moved down the list small mementos to distant relatives, tokens that carried stories none of them would ever tell aloud. Each name came and went until there was only one left. He unfolded the final page and said quietly, "To my granddaughter, Ava Bennett, I leave everything else." My breath hitched. The words filled the room in a way that made it suddenly too small. "Everything else," he repeated, scanning the page. "That includes the primary residence on Willow Hill Drive, the family cabin in Vermont, all financial accounts, investments, and controlling interest in Bennett Holdings." A murmur rippled through the relatives, low and disbelieving. Someone whispered, "You've got to be kidding," and another let out a quiet, nervous laugh. Mr. Keene went on as if he hadn't heard. "Ms. Bennett is also the sole beneficiary of Mr. Bennett's life insurance and retirement accounts, totaling approximately $6.2 million. The numbers didn't sound real, not in that room, not spoken aloud like that. My hands rested flat against my knees. Across the table, my mother's composure fractured. "This is absurd," she said, rising to her feet. "We will contest this." Mr. Keene folded his hands calmly. "You are, of course, free to do so," he said. "But, as stated in the video, any legal challenge will result in the immediate release of certain files to the press, to law enforcement, and to the proper regulatory agencies." The color drained from her face. She sat back down, eyes unfocused, as if trying to measure what that meant. My father exhaled slowly, a low sound that might have been a growl. Brooke turned away, eyes glistening but hard. The only sound left was the faint ticking of the wall clock. For the first time in years, I wasn't the one shrinking. I wasn't the one being silenced. I looked around the table and saw not power, not wealth, just people who didn't know what to do now that someone had called their bluff. My father leaned forward, voice carefully measured. "Ava, be reasonable. This isn't what your grandfather wanted. He must have been misled. None of us want to see you hurt by this mistake." I held his gaze. He knew exactly what he was doing. Brooke spoke next, her voice brittle but soft. You didn't even come to his funeral. Because no one told me he died, I said. I found out from a newspaper notice. That landed heavier than I expected. My mother's eyes flickered, and for a fleeting second, something like regret crossed her face before she looked away. Mr. Keene closed the folder gently and leaned back. Mr. Bennett anticipated this reaction, he said. He wanted clarity, not confusion. His instructions are specific, and they leave no room for misinterpretation. The room stayed still. No one seemed to know what to say. Finally, my mother smoothed her dress and turned toward me, her tone sugar-coated but brittle at the edges. Ava, darling, surely you understand how complicated things like this can be. Grandpa wasn't well. We're a family. We can sort this out privately. Family, I said quietly. You told me an hour ago that I wasn't part of this family. Her lips parted, but no words came. Mr. Keene glanced between us, then began gathering the documents into his briefcase. I'll leave certified copies for everyone, he said. But unless there are further questions, we're concluded here. No one moved. The air felt thick, the kind that comes before a storm. As people began to stand and file toward the door, I stayed where I was. My father stopped beside me, voice low. You think this makes you powerful? That money won't change what you are? I looked up at him steady. It's not money that changes things, I said. It's what you do with it. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, jaw flexing. He walked out without another word. Brooke followed, heels tapping quickly across the floor. My mother was last slower this time, her hand brushing the back of the chair as she passed. For a brief moment, she paused beside me. I could smell the faint trace of her perfume, the same scent she wore when she used to tuck my hair behind my ear as a child. She didn't look at me. She just whispered, "You'll regret this." Then she was gone. When the door clicked shut, the quiet was almost comforting. Mr. Keene lingered, stacking the last of the papers into his leather case. Your grandfather was very deliberate, he said. He trusted you to decide what comes next. I nodded, though I wasn't sure what that meant yet. As I stepped outside into the cool evening, the city hummed beyond the stone steps. Cars passed their headlights, glancing across the building's windows. My reflection caught in the glass a face I barely recognized, calm but tired, steady in a way it hadn't been before. The weight of the folder Mr. Keene handed me felt heavier than paper. Inside was proof of something I hadn't allowed myself to believe for years, that my grandfather had seen me, understood me, and chosen me for who I was, not who they wanted me to be. The night air carried the faint scent of rain. I walked toward my car, the sound of my shoes on the pavement grounding me with each step. Behind me, the law office door closed again, the echo fading into the street. I knew this wasn't over. My family didn't lose quietly. And as the wind lifted the corner of my coat, I could almost hear my grandfather's voice in my head, steady and patient, reminding me that truth always leaves an echo long after the noise dies down. By the time I reached the car, I wasn't thinking about the money or the house or the company. I was thinking about what came next and how I'd make sure his legacy became more than just a list of assets on a page. The week after the will reading felt strangely quiet. The city moved on, but my phone didn't ring, and the silence from my family stretched long enough to feel deliberate. I returned to my apartment and threw myself into work, trying to lose the sound of my grandfather's voice playing in my mind. At the shelter, paperwork and phone calls filled the hours, but every night I caught myself replaying his words, hearing the calm certainty behind them. He had known exactly what he was doing. 3 days later, Mr. Keene called. His voice was steady, professional as always. "Ava," he said, "there's one last item we didn't cover. A personal letter and an addendum he asked me to deliver privately." He paused. "Would you like to come by, or should I send them over?" I drove to his office that afternoon. When I arrived, Daniel led me to a smaller conference room instead of the formal one we'd used before. The air smelled faintly of coffee and old wood polish. Mr. Keene handed me a sealed envelope with my name written in my grandfather's firm handwriting, the kind that never wavered. He finished this a week before he passed. Mr. Keene said quietly, "He wanted you to have it when you were alone." I nodded and slipped it into my bag. "There's also this," he added, passing over a small brass key on a leather tag marked Willow Hill. "The property title has already transferred. You'll find everything you need in the folder inside." By the time I reached my car, dusk had turned the sky the color of cooling steel. I sat for a moment, the letter unopened on the seat beside me. The paper felt heavier than it should have, like it carried more than words. When I finally broke the seal, his handwriting filled the page. "Ava," it began. "If you're reading this, you already know the truth about what I've done. I imagine the room was full of noise when it landed, but I hope you listened past it." He wrote about the house on Willow Hill, how it had always been meant for me. He said he'd watched me build a life on honesty when others built theirs on showmanship, and that this house was a place where truth could live quietly. "There's more value in peace than there ever was in property," he'd written near the end. "Use what I've left to build something lasting." I folded the letter carefully and sat back. The engine ticked in the cooling air, and through the windshield I could see the city lights starting to bloom against the dark. I didn't feel triumphant or vindicated, just steady the way the ground feels after a storm when the rain finally stops. The next morning I drove out to Willow Hill for the first time in years. The road curved gently upward through tall pines, and when the house came into view, I slowed, almost without meaning to. It looked just as I remembered: white clapboard walls, wide front porch windows that caught the morning light. The garden had grown wild roses climbing the railing in uneven bursts, but the bones of the place were still solid. Inside, dust motes drifted in thin beams of sunlight. The air smelled faintly of cedar, and something familiar I couldn't name right away. My grandfather's old chair still sat by the window, its fabric worn at the arms. I set my bag down on the table and stood there for a long time, listening to the stillness. I spent the afternoon opening drawers, finding traces of him everywhere: receipts folded neatly, notes in the margins of old books, even the half-finished crossword on the kitchen counter. Each detail felt like a conversation paused mid-sentence. By evening, I had cleaned enough space to make coffee. I sat at the table with the cup between my hands and stared out the window as the light softened. For the first time in a long while, I wasn't trying to fix or prove anything. The quiet didn't feel empty anymore. Later that week, I went back to the shelter with an idea that had been forming since the reading. During a staff meeting, I asked our director, Ms. Carver, if we could start a transitional housing program, temporary stays for women leaving abusive homes who couldn't yet afford rent. She hesitated, calculating costs. I told her I'd fund it myself. Her expression softened. "You'd do that?" I nodded. "We'll call it Willow House," I said, after someone who believed in second chances. Over the next few weeks, I made the trips back and forth between the city and Willow Hill clearing rooms, repairing leaks and repainting walls. Some of the women from the shelter volunteered to help, and laughter began to echo through the halls where silence had lived for years. We stripped wallpaper, planted herbs along the kitchen windows, and sanded the porch railings smooth again. One afternoon, as the sun slanted through the living room, I stood by the window with paint on my hands, listening to the sound of their voices drifting up the stairs. It was the kind of sound that made a house feel alive again. While the work continued, I started receiving emails from distant relatives, some polite, others sharp-edged and full of suggestion. One from Brooke simply said, "We need to talk." I didn't reply. Mr. Keene called once more, informing me that the press had started asking questions after the transfer of Bennett Holdings became public record. "You'll likely hear from your father soon," he said. "He's not taking this quietly." I thanked him and told him I wasn't surprised. It didn't take long. 2 nights later, my father called. I almost didn't answer, but curiosity won. His voice was calm, too calm. "Ava," he began, "you've made things difficult for everyone. Your mother's beside herself. Brooke's reputation is being dragged through mud. Is that really what you want?" "What I want," I said, "is accountability." He sighed, the sound measured. "You've always had a self-righteous streak, but if you think this money makes you better than us, you're mistaken. You'll see soon enough what family loyalty means." The line went dead before I could respond. I sat for a while, the phone still in my hand, listening to the faint hum of the house settling around me. The conversation didn't surprise me, but it solidified something inside. My grandfather hadn't left me an inheritance to hold over anyone. He'd left me a choice to carry forward what mattered and let the rest fall away. That night, I walked out onto the porch. The air smelled of rain and wood smoke from a neighbor's chimney down the hill. Across the yard, the roses had started to open again, small and defiant. I thought of the women who would soon live here, the ones still learning how to breathe freely, after years of being told they couldn't. The porch light flickered once, then steadied. Somewhere in the distance, a fox barked. The house felt less like a monument and more like a beginning. I didn't know yet how my family would respond to that, but I knew the next time they came knocking, the door would open on my terms. Inside, on the kitchen table, my grandfather's letter lay beneath a small glass paperweight. The last line caught my eye again as I passed "Use what I've left to build something lasting." I turned off the lights and climbed the stairs, leaving the window open to the cool night air. The wind carried the faint scent of rain and roses through the room, and somewhere between those two things, I could almost hear his voice again, steady, certain, and unafraid of the truth waiting ahead. 2 weeks after my father's call, I got an invitation that surprised me even more. It came as a printed card slipped through the mail slot at Willow Hill. The envelope had my name written in my mother's looping cursive and the faint scent of her perfume. Inside was a simple message: family dinner. Sunday, 6 p.m. at the house. Important. No apology, no context, just an order wrapped in civility. For a few minutes I stared at the note under the kitchen light. The word family felt almost ironic now. Still, part of me knew they wouldn't have reached out unless there was a reason, and I had a feeling it wasn't reconciliation. I set the card aside and went back to painting the last of the guest room trim, the soft blue catching in the afternoon light. By Sunday, curiosity outweighed hesitation. I drove into the city just before sunset, the sky streaked with gold and gray. Their house looked the same: perfect hedges, polished porch lanterns, the kind of symmetry that never allowed for anything out of place. Through the front windows I could see movement. Brooke pacing near the fireplace, my father straightening his cuffs, my mother setting the table as though we were about to welcome guests instead of ghosts. When I rang the bell, the door opened almost immediately. My mother smiled in that way she always did, when someone else might be watching, polite, thin, not quite real. "Ava," she said softly, "I'm glad you came." I stepped inside. The air smelled of rosemary and wine sauce, the kind of meal meant to impress. My father's greeting was clipped but measured. "You look well." Brooke stayed silent, scrolling her phone, though I caught her eyes flick toward me, then away again. Dinner began the same way every family dinner used to, with small talk that didn't reach deeper than the tablecloth. My mother asked about the house in a tone that suggested she was testing the edges of the conversation. My father poured himself more wine before she finished the question. When dessert arrived, the tension finally broke. My father set his glass down and leaned forward. "Ava," he said, "we need to discuss something important, something that affects all of us." I waited. "The company," he continued, "is facing an audit. Some contracts are under review, and your grandfather's statements may have complicated things." He exchanged a quick glance with my mother before adding, "We think it would be wise if you considered transferring your controlling shares back to the family. Temporarily." "Temporarily," I repeated. "Yes," my mother said quickly, "just until things settle. You know how sensitive these matters can be." Brooke finally spoke. "If the board finds out about the—" She stopped herself, then smiled weakly. "Dad just needs stability right now." I set my fork down. "You're asking me to give up the one safeguard he put in place." "It's not about that," my father said, voice tightening. "It's about loyalty. We're trying to protect the company's legacy. Our legacy." I met his eyes. "He built that legacy. You spent it." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. My mother's hand fluttered toward her glass, her knuckles pale. "Ava, please. No one's blaming anyone. We just need to work together. It's what your grandfather would have wanted." I looked around the table at the polished silver, the expensive wine, the same house where I'd once been told not to embarrass them with my career choices. "He wanted integrity," I said. "That's all he ever asked for." Brooke rolled her eyes. "Don't act like you're some moral hero. You just got lucky. Grandpa had a soft spot for you." "That's it." Something inside me steadied. Maybe he saw something you didn't. My father's chair scraped against the floor as he stood. "Enough," he said sharply. You will sign the transfer documents. You can't possibly understand the implications here, Mr. Keene's words from the will echoed in my mind about the files, the evidence, the conditions. I stayed calm. You're right, I said quietly. I don't understand the need to keep repeating the same mistakes. My mother rose next, her voice cracking slightly. We are still your family. Don't forget who raised you. I looked at her, and for the first time I saw how much she believed her own version of that. You taught me how to look good, I said. Grandpa taught me how to be good. Those aren't the same thing. Brooke let out a short, breathy laugh. You think you're better than us because you paint walls for women who can't pay rent. I stood pushing my chair back slowly. No, Brooke. I just stopped pretending that money fixes everything. My father's tone dropped to a low growl. You walk out that door tonight, Ava, and don't expect any of us to come after you again. I looked around the room one last time. The portraits on the walls, the polished floors, the gleam of a life built on illusion. You already made that choice, I said. Then I turned and left. Outside, the air was cool and sharp against my skin. I didn't look back as I walked to my car. The windows of the house glowed behind me, but from the sidewalk the light looked hollow like it belonged to strangers. When I reached Willow Hill, the porch light flicked on automatically, casting a soft glow over the front steps. I sat there for a while, letting the quiet settle. Inside, the smell of fresh paint still lingered, mixed with the faint sweetness of the herbs we'd planted. It didn't feel like a refuge anymore. It felt like home. The next morning, I met Ms. Carver for coffee to finalize the plans for Willow House. She slid a folder across the table with the final permit approvals. You did it, she said, smiling. The first families can move in next month. I exhaled slowly, the tension from the night before, fading just enough to let relief through. We did it, I said. Back at the house, I called a few of the women who'd helped with the renovations to share the news. By evening, the place buzzed with quiet excitement as they hung curtains and set up the new furniture. One of them, Lena, looked around the freshly painted hallways and said softly, It feels like a place where things can start over. I nodded. That's exactly what it's for. Later that night, as the others left and the house grew quiet again, I walked through the rooms one last time. The walls gleamed faintly in the lamplight, and the floorboards creaked under my steps. I stopped by the window where my grandfather's chair now sat and looked out at the yard. The roses were still in bloom, despite the cooler weather defiant as ever. A light rain began to fall soft against the glass. I rested my hand on the windowsill and whispered, It's done, Grandpa. The words weren't loud, but they felt final in the best way. Downstairs, the old clock in the hallway chimed once, a low, steady sound that echoed through the empty rooms. Somewhere in that sound, I could almost hear his approval, a reminder that peace doesn't always arrive with celebration. Sometimes it's just the quiet certainty that you've done what's right. I turned off the light and went upstairs knowing this wasn't the end. My family had made their move and I had made mine. What came next would decide whether truth could stand on its own or whether they'd try to bury it one last time. The following Friday morning began quietly. Sunlight streamed through the front windows of Willow Hill Landing across the new hardwood floor. The house smelled faintly of coffee and fresh paint, the air still warm from the laughter that had filled it the night before. Willow House was officially open. The first 3 women had arrived with small suitcases and tired eyes, each one carrying more weight than she should have. Lena met them at the porch, showing them their rooms with the steady confidence of someone who had once needed the same kindness herself. Watching them settle in made the house feel whole again, like it was finally being used for what it was meant to be. By late afternoon, I was heading back to the city for a meeting at the shelter when my phone buzzed. It was an email from Brooke. The subject line simply said, "You owe us a chance." I hesitated before opening it. Her message was short and careful, almost rehearsed. "Dad wants to see you," it read. "He says he'll meet wherever you choose. We need to talk before things get worse." I read it twice, then forwarded it to Mr. Keene with a note that said, "Only advice." His reply came less than an hour later. "If you go," he wrote, "make it public, make it brief, and record everything." It was the kind of answer I expected from him, measured, professional, and quietly protective. That Sunday, we met at a cafe downtown with large windows that faced the park. My father arrived first. His suit pressed his expression unreadable. My mother trailed behind him, pearls at her throat, eyes scanning the room like she expected someone to recognize her. Brooke came last, looking smaller than I remembered, her phone clutched in her hand like a lifeline. I didn't stand when they approached. My father began the conversation before I could even greet them. "You've made this situation unnecessarily complicated," he said. "The board is on edge. We can't operate effectively while your name sits above ours on every document." I stirred my coffee, letting the silence stretch. "I didn't create those contracts," I said finally. "He did." My mother reached across the table, her tone soft but trembling. "Ava, please. We're family. We can fix this. You don't have to punish us like this." I set the spoon down. "Is that what you think this is? Punishment?" Brooke leaned forward, her voice quieter. "The media's getting wind of things. Someone leaked details about Dad's clients. If this continues, we'll all go down together." I met her eyes. "Then maybe you should start telling the truth." My father's jaw tightened. "Watch your tone." "I have," I said evenly. "For years." The table went still. My mother's hand faltered, the bracelets at her wrist clinking against one another. "Ava," she whispered, "we raised you better than this." I looked at her, feeling the calm settle like cool air. "No, you raised me to stay quiet." My father pushed back from the table, standing just enough to tower over the conversation. "If you think that video or his will makes you untouchable, you're mistaken. You have no idea what kind of mess you're walking into." "Then help me understand it," I said. "Tell me what you've done." He stared down at me the way he used to when I was a child who didn't follow orders. Then, without another word, he gathered his coat and walked out the cafe door, closing behind him with a soft chime. Brooke followed him halfway, then stopped. She looked back at me, eyes glistening. "He's scared," she said quietly. "More than I've ever seen him. They're investigating everything now, his accounts, the loans, all of it." "Then maybe it's time he faced it," I said. She shook her head, her voice breaking. "You don't understand. If he falls, we all do. I'll lose my contracts. Mom will lose the house. Everything." "You already lost it," I said gently. "Grandpa's will made sure of that." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them back. "He only left it to you because he pitied you." I stood gathering my coat. "Maybe, but he trusted me to do what you wouldn't." When I stepped outside, the wind carried the first chill of autumn through the park. The trees were beginning to turn their colors bright against the gray sky. I walked until my breath slowed, until the sound of the city faded into the distance. That evening, I sat on the porch at Willow Hill while Lena finished locking up. The porch lights glowed softly across the yard. "Rough day," she asked, setting down 2 mugs of tea. I smiled faintly. "You could say that." She nodded toward the house. "They're safe here. Whatever's happening out there, this place feels different." "You did that." Her words settled in the quiet between us. "We did," I said. Before she left, she handed me a folded newspaper she'd picked up in town. "You should see this," she said. The front page headline read, "Real Estate Firm Under Federal Investigation." My father's company name sat squarely in the center of the article, with phrases like "client misrepresentation" and "financial misconduct" underlined in bold. The following day, Mr. Keene called to confirm what I already suspected. "It's official," he said. "The inquiry started weeks ago. Your grandfather's documentation was submitted directly to the authorities. It appears he prepared this long before his passing." For a moment, I didn't know what to say. He knew this would happen. "Yes," Mr. Keene replied. "He made sure the truth couldn't disappear even after he was gone." The next few days passed in a blur of phone calls and statements. Reporters showed up at the gates hoping for a comment. I refused every request. Instead, I spent my time with the women at Willow House, helping them move in, listening to stories that put my own troubles in perspective. One night, while washing dishes after dinner, I caught my reflection in the kitchen window. The face looking back wasn't the same woman who'd once begged for acceptance around a polished dining table. She looked tired, yes, but sure, like someone who had finally stepped into her own life. Later that week, Brooke called again. Her voice was different this time, softer, hesitant. "They froze Dad's accounts," she said. Mom's panicking. She keeps saying you're the only one who can fix this. I can't fix what they built, I said. But they can start by telling the truth. There was silence on the line. Then she whispered, "Maybe you're right." The next morning I found a small envelope slipped under my front door. No return address, no name, just my initials in neat handwriting. Inside was a single note, "We'll talk soon. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The paper smelled faintly of cologne I recognized too well my father's. I stood there for a long time holding it between my fingers. The air in the hallway felt heavy, but not unfamiliar. I slipped the note into my pocket and walked out onto the porch. The sun was rising low and amber across the hills, and the sound of laughter carried faintly from the guest wing where the women were already starting their morning routines. Somewhere behind that warmth was the storm I knew was coming, but for the first time, I wasn't afraid of it. I turned toward the garden, the roses still holding dew on their petals, and let the cool air fill my lungs. Whatever they planned next, I would be ready. The truth was already out in the open, and there was no going back. The morning after the note appeared, a mist hung low over Willow Hill. Dew clung to the grass, and the air carried the quiet stillness that always came before a change. I stood on the porch with a mug of coffee in one hand and the folded note in the other. Its words burned into memory. "We'll talk soon. Don't make this harder than it needs to be." The handwriting wasn't familiar, but the scent of cologne left no doubt who had sent it. By mid-morning, Lena arrived with supplies for the house, a few grocery bags, and a bundle of donated clothes. She caught sight of the paper resting beside my cup. "That trouble knocking again?" she asked gently. I gave a small nod. "He's trying to scare me, or maybe warn me." Lena set the bags down. "You think he'd show up here?" "He already has," I said quietly. "Just not in person yet." We worked in silence for a while, stocking shelves and folding laundry for the women who had arrived that week. When the last of the tasks was done, Lena touched my arm. "If you need someone here tonight, I'll stay." I smiled faintly. "Thanks, but I'll be fine." After she left, the quiet grew heavier. Around dusk, headlights swept across the front lawn and a car door slammed. I looked through the window and saw my father walking toward the porch. The same dark coat, the same confidence in his stride, though it looked thinner now, more brittle. I opened the door before he could knock. "Ava," he said, voice low, "you shouldn't ignore messages from your family." "I wasn't ignoring you," I said. "You just didn't have anything new to say." He stepped inside without waiting for permission. His eyes moved over the furniture, the framed photographs, the smell of fresh paint. "You've done well for yourself here," he said. "Grand old house. Shame it's being wasted. On women trying to rebuild their lives." He gave a humorless laugh. "On people who can't keep one." I folded my arms. "Why are you here, Dad?" He reached into his coat and pulled out a folder. "The investigation is expanding. They've started talking to Brooke. Your mother's losing sleep. I need you to make this stop." "I can't stop what Grandpa started," I said. He set the folder on the table, his voice tightening. "You can. You have the power to retract the evidence he filed. You can say he wasn't of sound mind after all. We both know how convincing you can be." I stared at him, the disbelief giving way to something steadier. "You want me to lie under oath?" He looked at me as if the word didn't mean anything. "You'd be saving your family." I stepped closer. "You're asking me to destroy the last honest thing he ever did." His tone hardened. "You owe us that much." "I don't owe you anything," I said quietly. The words landed heavier than I meant them to. For a moment, his expression faltered, then his jaw clenched again. "If this continues," he said, "you'll regret it. When they come for me, they'll drag all of us down, including you." I took a breath, forcing calm into my voice. "Then maybe you should finally tell them what really happened." He stared at me for a long moment, eyes sharp and calculating, then turned toward the door. "You've become just like him," he muttered. "Always thought you were better than everyone else." I didn't move as he left. The screen door banged once and swung shut behind him. Outside his car, engines started, headlights cutting across the yard before disappearing down the drive. When the sound faded, I realized my hands were shaking. I sat at the table staring at the folder he'd left behind. Inside were printed emails, contract copies, and bank records, evidence of everything he had tried to hide. I didn't know whether he'd meant it as a threat or a plea, but either way, it was proof. The next morning, I took the folder to Mr. Keene's office. He was already expecting me. I heard from the investigators this morning, he said, motioning for me to sit. Your father's partners have begun cooperating. It's only a matter of time now. I handed him the folder. He came to the house last night. Mr. Keene flipped through the pages, his brow furrowing. These are copies of documents we've already provided, but... He paused, pointing to a single line of handwriting scrawled across one page. It ends where it began. Did he say what that meant? No, I said, but I think he's running out of places to hide. That afternoon, the first news alert appeared online. Thomas Bennett, CEO of Bennett Holdings, temporarily steps down amid fraud allegations. The photo beneath this headline showed my father walking briskly from the courthouse, jaw tight, eyes narrowed against the cameras. My mother followed a few paces behind sunglasses covering half her face. Within hours, my phone began buzzing again. Reporters, former family friends, even distant cousins who hadn't spoken to me in years. I let every call go to voicemail. That night, Brooke showed up at the gate. She stood in the raincoat-soaked mascara streaked. "He's gone," she said when I opened the door. "Dad's disappearing. The investigators came this morning. He cleared out the home office before they arrived. Did they find Mom?" "She's at a hotel," Brooke said. "She keeps saying none of this is real." I motioned for her to come inside, handing her a towel. She stood in the entryway, dripping and shaking eyes, darting around the house like it was sacred ground she wasn't sure she was allowed to touch. "Why did he do it, Ava? He had everything." I didn't answer. Instead, I poured her a cup of tea and guided her to the couch. She wrapped her hands around the mug like she needed its warmth to stay upright. "I kept thinking he'd fix it," she whispered, "that he'd make some call and it would all go away like it always did. Grandpa tried to warn you," I said softly. "He gave him chance after chance." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "I know. I just didn't want to see it." We sat there in silence while the rain tapped gently against the windows. When she finally looked up, her voice was smaller. "Mom wants to talk to you. She said she's ready to listen." I studied her face, searching for truth in her words. "If she wants to talk, she knows where to find me." Brooke nodded, setting the cup down. "I'll tell her." She hesitated before standing. "You know, I think he was afraid of you. You remind him of Grandpa too much." When she left, the house felt quieter than usual, though not empty. I walked to the window, watching the last of the rain fade into mist. Somewhere beyond the hills, the truth my grandfather had protected was unfolding exactly as he intended. Later that night, I received a voicemail from Mr. Keene. His voice was calm but firm. "The authorities will be contacting you tomorrow. They may need a statement confirming that all funds were transferred legally to your name. It's standard procedure, but it will close the circle on this." I stood in the hallway phone, still against my ear, the words sinking in slowly. "Close the circle." It sounded final. Outside, the porch light flickered once before steadying, casting a soft glow over the garden. The roses gleamed in the wet air, their petals heavy with rain. Somewhere in that stillness, I realized what came next wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about setting everything right one last time. I turned off the light and looked toward the horizon where morning would soon rise. The storm had finally broken, but the reckoning wasn't over yet. What waited next was the moment my grandfather had prepared me for, the one where truth met consequence face to face. The morning after Mr. Keene's call, the air felt lighter, as if the house itself had been waiting for release. I stood on the porch with the phone still warm in my hand and watched the first line of sunlight break through the trees. For the first time since all of it began, I didn't feel the weight of waiting, only a calm awareness that the worst was behind us. The investigators had what they needed. The company my father built on pretense was now in the hands of people who valued truth more than polish. By the end of that week, the headlines shifted from accusation to aftermath. Thomas Bennett charged with fraud and embezzlement. Elaine Bennett named in civil inquiry. The stories ran their course, replaced soon enough by newer scandals, but the damage lingered quietly in their world of gated charity dinners and whispered reputations. Brooke stopped posting online altogether. She sent me one final message. "I'm leaving the city for a while. I need to figure out who I am without them. I wrote back wishing her peace, and for the first time in years, it didn't feel like closing a door. It felt like leaving one slightly open. Mr. Keene visited a few days later with a small box from the courthouse. Inside were copies of the final filings and the signed transfer confirming that every asset tied to Willow Hill and the foundation was protected in my name. He smiled as he handed me the papers. "Your grandfather would be proud," he said. I thanked him, though the word didn't seem big enough for everything he'd done. After he left, I sat at the kitchen table reading through the documents until the light faded each signature, another piece of proof that justice didn't always roar, it could whisper too steady and deliberate. That weekend, Willow House hosted its first community dinner. The women cooked together, filling the kitchen with laughter and the scent of garlic and bread. Lena moved easily among them, her sleeves rolled up, guiding a new resident through a recipe. I looked around the table and thought about how far the house had come from the day I found it dust-covered and silent. It wasn't a monument to wealth anymore, it was a place that breathed. Later that evening, after the dishes were washed and the house grew quiet, I walked outside to the garden. The roses had begun to bloom again, pale pink against the dark soil. I found the spot near the porch where my grandfather used to sit when he visited, and I set down a small, framed photo of him. The one where he's smiling behind his glasses, eyes creased at the corners. The wind lifted softly through the yard, and I could almost hear his voice telling me not to lose heart, not to let truth scare me into silence. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail with no return address. Inside was a single sentence written in my mother's elegant script. "I'm sorry for the silence." There was no signature, no attempt to explain. I folded the letter and placed it in the same box that held my grandfather's note. Some part of me hoped it meant she'd finally stopped trying to rewrite the past. By midsummer, the garden was full again. Children from the shelter played on the grass, while their mothers met with counselors inside. The sound of laughter mixed with the rustle of leaves, and for the first time the house felt whole. I spent most mornings helping Lena with paperwork afternoons, fixing things around the property evenings, sitting on the porch with a glass of tea. Peace came quietly, like a visitor who didn't need to be announced. Sometimes I still think about my father, where he might be, whether he ever looks back on the choices that brought him down. But the ache that used to follow his name has faded into something gentler, like the memory of a bruise that's finally healed. My life isn't built around their approval anymore. It's built around purpose and the people who remind me what it means to start again. One evening in late September, as the sun dipped low behind the hills, I stood by the porch railing and looked out over the property. The women were gathered by the fire pit, talking softly, the glow of the flames lighting their faces. I realized that my grandfather's greatest gift wasn't money or property. It was the faith that doing what's right, even when it costs you everything, is its own kind of inheritance. He used to say that integrity doesn't make life easier. It makes it worth living. Now I finally understood what he meant. If you've ever had to choose between peace and approval, I hope you choose peace. Because once the noise fades and the truth settles, what's left is the kind of freedom no one can take away. And if this story found you at the right moment, take a second to breathe it in. Leave a thought, share it if it speaks to you, and remember, no matter where you start, it's never too late to build something honest and lasting.